The night of April 14, 1912. The Titanic, the largest and most luxurious ship of its time, collides with an iceberg in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. More than 1,500 people lose their lives in what would become the most famous maritime tragedy of all time. But what if I told you that the Titanic isn't even among the deadliest shipwrecks in history? There is a shipwreck that claims 6 times more lives than the Titanic, and almost no one talks about it. An overcrowded ship, a freezing sea, a deadly attack. This is the story of the greatest shipwreck of all time. The tragedy the world chose to forget. Brace yourself, because what happened that night was far worse than you can imagine. Everyone knows the story of the Titanic. A luxurious ocean liner, declared unsinkable, that met its tragic fate in 1912. With more than 2,200 people on board, the collision with an iceberg resulted in one of the greatest maritime disasters of the 20th century. Around 1,500 people lost their lives that night. But why did this story become so legendary? Why, among so many shipwrecks throughout history, was it the Titanic that became etched into collective memory? The answer is simple: media, mystery, and spectacle. The Titanic disaster was an event surrounded by wealth and drama. Millionaire passengers, bands playing as the ship went down, an insufficient number of lifeboats, and a cinematic ending. Decades later, Hollywood turned this tragedy into one of the most watched films of all time, cementing the idea that the Titanic was the greatest maritime catastrophe in history. But that perception is wrong. The Titanic may be the most famous, but it is far from the deadliest. What almost no one knows is that there was a shipwreck that resulted in more than 9,000 deaths, a number 6 times greater than the Titanic's. If the Titanic was already a nightmare, imagine a ship with 3 times as many people on board in freezing waters, being attacked without mercy. A brutal, swift shipwreck forgotten by time. And the most shocking part? You've probably never even heard of it. The year was 1945. World War II was coming to an end, and chaos had taken over Europe. Thousands of civilians were desperately trying to escape the advance of the Red Army, fleeing conflict zones at any cost. In the midst of this desperation, a colossal ship embarked on a last-ditch mission, to evacuate as many people as possible before it was too late. That ship was the Wilhelm Gustloff. Originally designed as a luxury cruise ship, the Wilhelm Gustloff was repurposed as a transport vessel during the war. On January 30, 1945, it set sail carrying far more passengers than it was built for. Officially, it was designed for around 1,900 passengers, but that night, it carried more than 10,000 people on board, most of them desperate civilians trying to escape the horrors of war. Women, children, wounded soldiers. A true sea of people clinging to their last thread of hope. But hope wouldn't last long. As it sailed through the freezing Baltic Sea, the Wilhelm Gustloff found itself in the crosshairs of the Soviet submarine S-13, commanded by Captain Alexander Marinesko. The war wasn't over yet, and to the Soviets, any German vessel was a legitimate target. Without warning, 3 torpedoes were fired at the ship. The impact was devastating. Explosions tore through the hull, and within minutes, panic consumed everyone on board. With temperatures plunging to nearly minus 20 degrees Celsius, anyone who fell into the water wouldn't survive for more than a few minutes. The ship tilted rapidly, and in less than an hour, it disappeared beneath the dark waters of the Baltic. Of the more than 10,000 people on board, only around 1,200 survived. That means approximately 9,000 people died that night, making the sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff 6 times deadlier than the Titanic. And yet, few people know this story. If the sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff was so devastating, why was this tragedy practically erased from history? Why does everyone know about the Titanic, yet almost no one has heard of this disaster that claimed thousands more lives? The answer lies in politics, war, and historical narrative. Unlike the Titanic, which was a symbol of technology and luxury in its time, the Wilhelm Gustloff was a German ship in the middle of World War II. And that changes everything. The tragedy occurred at a time when the world was focused on other catastrophes. Battles, cities being destroyed, millions dying on the battlefields and in bombings ***. In the face of the horrors of war, a single sunken ship seemed like just another statistic. But there was an even more delicate factor. The Wilhelm Gustloff carried civilians but also German soldiers, which complicated its place in post-war narratives. For the Soviets who sank the ship, this wasn't an attack on innocent people. It was a blow against the enemy. For the Germans, speaking about this tragedy meant remembering a past that many preferred to bury. And unlike the Titanic, which had newspapers, books, and films immortalizing its story, the Wilhelm Gustloff was forgotten. No major Hollywood studio turned this tragedy into an emotional epic. No global campaign made it a symbol. It became a lost page in history, a story that few people know, until now. The tragedy of the Wilhelm Gustloff was not just one of the worst shipwrecks in history, it also had a profound impact on the war and on how tragedies are remembered. But as we've seen, unlike the Titanic, this story was silenced. Even with the war nearing its end, the attack on the Wilhelm Gustloff demonstrated how neither side was willing to show mercy. For the Soviets, it was a precise strike against the Germans, a symbol of vengeance for the destruction they had suffered. For the Germans, it was a bitter defeat, but amid the collapse of the Third Reich, there was no time for mourning or memorials. Furthermore, the victims of the shipwreck, mostly German civilians, were left out of history for a cruel reason. After the war, any German tragedy was met with skepticism. The world was still coming to terms with the horrors, and because of that, the lives lost on the Wilhelm Gustloff were simply forgotten. But what few people know is that this was not the only major shipwreck that was ignored. Just a few weeks later, another German ship, the Goya, was sunk in the Baltic Sea, killing more than 7,000 people. And just like the Wilhelm Gustloff, its story was swept under the rug. The German shipwrecks at the end of World War II serve as a dark reminder of how history can be selective. Some tragedies are immortalized. Others are simply discarded. The sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff was one of the greatest maritime disasters in history, but unlike the Titanic, it never received the attention it deserved. Maybe because it happened in the middle of a war. Maybe because its victims were on the wrong side of history. Or maybe because some tragedies simply don't interest the world. But this raises an even more unsettling question. How many other stories like this have been forgotten? How many tragedies have been buried by time, ignored because they didn't fit the narrative we were told? The Titanic became an icon, a legend. The Wilhelm Gustloff? Just a shadow lost in the past. But now you know the truth. And if this was the deadliest shipwreck of all time, what other stories are still hidden beneath the waters? If you want to uncover more hidden mysteries like this, you know what to do. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and leave a like. It helps a lot to keep bringing stories like this to you. And if you've heard of the Wilhelm Gustloff or know of other forgotten shipwrecks, drop a comment below. See you in the next video.